Despite the systematic oppression, there were moments when the poor refused to accept their fate. These uprisings were rare, brutally suppressed, and often ended in even greater suffering for the survivors. But they represent something important: the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be completely crushed, even under the most extreme circumstances. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was one of the largest and most significant uprisings of the medieval period. It began with a simple demand: an end to the poll tax that was crushing poor families. But it quickly grew into something much larger, a fundamental challenge to the entire social order. The rebels, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, didn't just want lower taxes. They wanted to abolish serfdom entirely, redistribute the land, and create a society based on equality rather than hereditary privilege. Their slogan was revolutionary: "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" For a brief moment, it seemed like the impossible might happen. The rebels captured London, destroyed the houses of nobles, and forced the king to negotiate. They burned the legal documents that enslaved them, opened the prisons, and declared that all men were free and equal. But the revolution was doomed from the start. The rebels were starving, poorly armed, and outnumbered by professional soldiers. When Wat Tyler was murdered during peace negotiations, the rebellion collapsed. The retribution was swift and merciless. Thousands of rebels were executed, their bodies displayed as warnings to others who might consider rebellion. The aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt was even worse than the conditions that had caused it. The authorities cracked down harder on the poor, increasing punishments for any sign of dissent. The legal system became more brutal, the taxes more oppressive, and the social controls more rigid. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe throughout the medieval period. The Jacquerie in France in 1358 saw peasants burning castles and murdering nobles. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 involved hundreds of thousands of rebels fighting for basic human rights. The result was always the same: initial success followed by brutal suppression and even worse conditions for the survivors. What's remarkable about these rebellions is not that they failed, but that they happened at all. People who had been systematically brutalized, starved, and dehumanized still found the courage to stand up and demand justice. They knew the odds were against them, they knew the consequences would be terrible, but they chose to fight anyway. The Church's response to these uprisings was particularly hypocritical. While preaching about love, compassion, and justice, Church leaders consistently supported the authorities in crushing rebellions. They declared that rebellion against earthly authority was rebellion against God, and they excommunicated rebels to ensure they would be damned in the afterlife as well as punished in this life. Women played crucial roles in many of these uprisings, though their contributions are often overlooked by historians. They served as messengers, spies, and fighters. They smuggled weapons, provided food for rebels, and often paid the ultimate price when the rebellions were crushed. Despite the systematic oppression, some poor people did manage to survive and even occasionally improve their situations. These survival strategies reveal both the ingenuity of desperate people and the tiny cracks in the system that could sometimes be exploited. Marriage was one of the most important survival strategies, but it had to be carefully managed. A woman marrying into a slightly better family could improve her situation, while a man marrying a woman with useful skills could increase his chances of survival. But these marriages were often strategic alliances rather than romantic partnerships, and they could be dissolved if they didn't provide the expected benefits. Skill development was another crucial strategy. A serf who learned a valuable trade, blacksmithing, carpentry, brewing, might be able to negotiate better conditions with their lord. But learning these skills was difficult when you were already working from dawn to dusk just to survive, and the guilds that controlled most trades were closed to the poor. Some people managed to escape serfdom by running away to cities. Urban areas offered more anonymity and sometimes more opportunities for work. The saying, "city air makes free," reflected the legal principle that a serf who lived in a city for a year and a day without being reclaimed by their lord would become a free person. But urban life brought its own challenges. Cities were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and often just as dangerous as rural areas. Many escaped serfs found themselves in even worse conditions than they had left behind, working in dangerous industries or forced into prostitution or crime. The black market was another survival strategy. People smuggled food, avoided taxes, and traded in goods that were supposed to be controlled by their lords. This underground economy was risky. The penalties for being caught were severe. But it was sometimes the only way to obtain necessities. Some people survived by becoming indispensable to their oppressors. A serf who became a skilled craftsman, a trusted servant, or even a spy might be treated better than others. But this strategy required them to collaborate with the system that oppressed them, often at the expense of their fellow serfs. Religious life offered another potential escape route. Joining a monastery or convent could provide food, shelter, and protection from the worst abuses of the feudal system. But religious houses were often closed to the poor, requiring substantial donations that most people couldn't afford. The most desperate survival strategy was crime. Theft, poaching, and smuggling were common among the poor, not because they were naturally criminal, but because they had no legal means of survival. The forests were full of outlaws who had chosen to risk death as bandits rather than accept death as serfs. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval poverty was how it shaped the psychology of both the oppressed and the oppressors. The system wasn't just designed to extract labor and resources, it was designed to create a mindset that would perpetuate itself across generations. The poor were systematically taught to see their suffering as normal, necessary, and even deserved. The church preached that poverty was a virtue, that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, and that rebellion against authority was a sin against God. This psychological conditioning was so effective that many poor people actually defended the system that oppressed them. The concept of learned helplessness explains much of what we see in medieval society. When people are repeatedly subjected to painful experiences they cannot control, they often stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible. Many serfs who had the opportunity to run away chose to stay, not because they were happy, but because they couldn't imagine any other way of life. The constant threat of violence created a state of chronic stress that affected both physical and mental health. People living under these conditions developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, but they had no understanding of mental health and no treatment for their trauma. They often turned to alcohol, which was readily available and provided temporary escape from their misery. The social isolation of the poor was another form of psychological control. Serfs were often forbidden from traveling, gathering in groups, or communicating with people from other villages. This isolation prevented them from realizing that their suffering was not unique or inevitable, that other people lived better lives, and that change was possible. The system also created psychological divisions within families and communities. Parents were forced to choose between their children, husbands were pitted against wives, and neighbors were encouraged to spy on each other. This destroyed the social bonds that might have provided support and resistance to the system. The oppressors also suffered psychological damage from their participation in the system. Many nobles and lords became callous and cruel, not because they were born evil, but because the system required them to treat other human beings as property. They developed elaborate justifications for their behavior, convincing themselves that the poor were inherently inferior and deserved their fate. The religious authorities were perhaps the most psychologically damaged of all. They had to reconcile their beliefs about love and compassion with their support for a system based on cruelty and exploitation. Many developed a form of cognitive dissonance that allowed them to preach about Christian values while actively participating in the oppression of the poor. The impact of medieval poverty didn't end with the Middle Ages. The psychological, social, and economic patterns established during this period shaped European society for centuries to come, and their effects can still be seen today. The class system that emerged from medieval feudalism persisted long after serfdom was officially abolished. The idea that some people were inherently superior to others, that wealth was a sign of God's favor, and that the poor deserved their fate became deeply embedded in European culture. The treatment of women in medieval society established patterns of gender oppression that lasted well into the modern era. The idea that women were property, that their primary value was their ability to reproduce, and that they needed to be controlled by men became fundamental assumptions that weren't seriously challenged until the 20th century. The systematic exclusion of the poor from education created a cycle of ignorance and poverty that persisted for generations. Even when education became more widely available, the assumption that the poor were intellectually inferior continued to limit their opportunities. The religious justification for social inequality became a cornerstone of European Christianity. The idea that the poor should accept their suffering as God's will, that rebellion against authority was sinful, and that earthly inequality would be corrected in the afterlife, helped maintain social stability at the cost of human dignity. The economic systems developed during the medieval period, the concentration of land ownership, the exploitation of labor, and the use of debt to control populations, evolved into the capitalist systems that dominated Europe for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval period established the principle that human life had different values depending on social class. This principle would later be used to justify slavery, colonialism, and genocide. The idea that some people were expendable became a cornerstone of European expansion and exploitation. As we come to the end of this two-part series, it's important to remember that we're not just discussing ancient history. We're talking about millions of real people who lived, suffered, and died under conditions that were deliberately designed to crush their humanity. The women we've discussed, Margaret, Eleanor, and countless others, weren't statistics. They were human beings with hopes, dreams, and fears. They loved their children, mourned their losses, and struggled to find meaning in lives that offered little but suffering. The children, Anna, Thomas, and the millions like them, deserved better than the world gave them. They deserved to play, to learn, to grow up safely, and to have the chance to become the people they were meant to be. Instead, they were crushed by a system that saw them only as sources of labor and profit. The disabled, the elderly, the minorities, and all the other forgotten victims of medieval poverty remind us that oppression always targets the most vulnerable first. Their suffering was not inevitable. It was the result of human choices, human systems, and human cruelty. But their stories also remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything they endured, they loved, they laughed, they hoped, and they resisted. They found ways to survive, to help each other, and to maintain their dignity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. The rebellions we discussed, the Peasants' Revolt, the Jacquerie, and others, may have failed in the short term, but they planted seeds of ideas that would eventually grow into the concepts of human rights, democracy, and social justice that we value today. When we study medieval poverty, we're not just learning about the past, we're learning about the capacity for both cruelty and courage that exists within human societies. We're reminded that the freedoms and protections we take for granted today were bought with the blood and suffering of countless forgotten people. The next time you hear someone romanticize the Middle Ages or talk about the good old days, remember the faces of the people we've discussed. Remember that progress is not inevitable, that human rights are not guaranteed, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against the systems that would crush the weak for the benefit of the strong. Because being poor in medieval Europe wasn't just a death sentence, it was a reminder that human dignity is fragile, that justice is not natural, and that every generation must choose whether to perpetuate oppression or to fight for something better. Their suffering was not in vain if we learn from it. Their deaths were not meaningless if we remember them. And their stories are not just history if we use them to build a better future. The Tale of Guillaume the Landless. A story from the court records of Rouen, Anno Domini, 1348. In the bitter winter of 1348, when the Black Death had already claimed half the souls of Normandy, the court scribes of Rouen recorded a case that would echo through the stone corridors of justice for generations to come. It was the trial of Guillaume de Montfort, known to the townspeople simply as Guillaume the Landless. Guillaume had once been a freeman, owning a modest plot of land outside the city walls where he grew barley and kept 3 goats. But the great famine of 1315 had taken his first harvest, and the endless wars with the English had claimed his only son. When the tax collectors came in 1347, demanding silver for the king's war chest, Guillaume had nothing left to give but the very soil beneath his feet. The records tell us that Guillaume arrived in Rouen on the feast of St. Martin, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a wooden bowl his deceased wife had carved for him. For 3 days he begged outside the cathedral, his voice hoarse as he pleaded for scraps from the wealthy merchants who hurried past, their fur-lined cloaks pulled tight against the November wind. On the 4th day, hunger drove Guillaume to a decision that would seal his fate. The baker's shop on Rue du Gros Horloge displayed its bread in wooden baskets, golden loaves that seemed to mock his empty stomach. As the church bells rang vespers, Guillaume reached out with trembling hands and took a single loaf. Barely enough to fill a child, but in the eyes of the law, it was theft. The baker, Master Pierre Leclerc, was a man who had grown wealthy selling grain at inflated prices during the famine years. He showed no mercy for the starving stranger. Within minutes, Guillaume found himself dragged before the bailiff, his wrists bound with rough hemp rope that cut into his weathered skin. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted no longer than the time it takes to say 3 Ave Marias. Guillaume confessed readily. What use was denial when a dozen witnesses had seen his crime? The judge, Lord Robert de Caen, was a man known for his strict interpretation of the law. He had seen too many desperate souls turn to theft in these dark times, and he believed that only harsh punishment could maintain order in a world spinning toward chaos. Guillaume de Montfort, the judge declared, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. You stand accused of theft against the property of a freeman. The law is clear. Theft of goods worth more than 12 deniers is punishable by death. This bread you have stolen is valued at 15 deniers. Guillaume fell to his knees, not in protest, but in prayer. The court records note that he asked only for time to make his confession to a priest and to send word to his sister in Caen, though whether such word ever reached her, history does not tell us. 2 days later, as the morning mist rose from the Seine, Guillaume the Landless was led to the marketplace gibbet. The crowd that gathered was smaller than usual. The plague had thinned their numbers, and many feared that even witnessing an execution might bring God's wrath upon them. But still they came, these survivors of famine and pestilence, drawn perhaps by the terrible recognition that Guillaume's fate could easily have been their own. As the noose was placed around his neck, Guillaume spoke his final words, which the court clerk dutifully recorded. I took bread because I was hungry. I pray God forgives me, and I pray he forgives those who judge the starving with such mercy as this. The executioner pulled the lever at the stroke of 10, and Guillaume de Montfort passed from this world into whatever judgment awaited beyond. His body was left hanging for 3 days, as was the custom, a warning to all who might consider theft as their solution to poverty. But here lies the cruel irony that the chroniclers of Rouen could not help but note. That same week, Master Pierre Leclerc was discovered to have been selling bread mixed with sawdust and ground bone, cheating his customers and profiting from their desperation. His punishment? A fine of 20 livres, money he paid without hardship, and a public apology read from the church steps. The contrast was not lost on the people of Rouen. They whispered among themselves that Guillaume had stolen bread to live, while Pierre had stolen from the living to grow rich. Yet one man hung from the gibbet, while the other returned to his warm shop and full coffers. This tale, preserved in the yellowed parchments of the Rouen court archives, serves as a stark reminder of an age when poverty itself was treated as a crime deserving the ultimate punishment. Guillaume the Landless became one of hundreds who faced the hangman's rope, not for malice or greed, but for the simple crime of being hungry in a world that had forgotten mercy. The records end with this notation, written in the careful script of the court CEO.